Hi everybody, welcome back to another episode of Rapping with the Rep. I'm State Representative Ken Gordon, and it's really a thrill for me to be here with my colleague and my friend, Representative Marjorie Decker from Cambridge. Representative, you're the first of my colleagues who started with me. We call that being classmates.
Yes.
Who's been a guest on our show, so that's kind of fun
Yeah,
in and of
I know,
itself.
it's a very special bond you have when you get elected with a group of people and you experience all of this for the first time with each other.
We have a great group.
And I'm so lucky that you're my classmate, someone who I have a lot of respect for and work together well with.
Thank you. So we're going to talk about the conclusion of the legislative session that ended at the end of July, and we're still working on legislation now, but the only difference is we can't debate and we can't formally, because of the Constitution, we can't take formal votes, so that if someone wants to object to a particular bill that comes up or an amendment that comes up, it will stop everything.
Just
until
takes
we
one objection,
collect.
one person.
Right. But that doesn't mean that we're not still working,
Right.
as we are. But we had a session that really resulted in a lot of achievement. We had bills that deal with workers' rights. We had bills that deal with the rights of children. You've been working with a lot of children's rights. We had criminal justice reform that we were able to pass.
Women's health.
Women's health,
Public
that's right.
safety.
Right. I mean, really, the list goes on. And so I want to talk about some of the ways that we've been able to pass legislation that will affect people's lives here in the Commonwealth and in Cambridge, where you represent and live, and in Burlington and Bedford, where I represent and live. So let's talk about the things that are the most important to us. Now, I've been really impressed with the focus that you've had on children in our Commonwealth. I mean, that with laser focus, you worked on issues that will make their lives better. What are some of the ways that you think that we've been able to reach those goals and still work on those goals? We've got a Cap on Kids program that you've talked about that we're still working on.
Well, we passed it. We did the work. The governor chose to disagree with us and not support it, and so we call that he vetoed our bill. And then we came back and we overrode the bill with a vote, and then he vetoed it again. So we're still working on it, and I think we're going to get there. And for people who are listening, this is a bill, over 20 years ago, the legislature passed a bill, like many legislatures around the country did, that said if you are so poor and so low income and it's beyond your control at that moment, that you should have some assistance from the government. And for some people, small percentage of people, that comes in a form of cash assistance, which is very little. And but there was a cap, and it said that so if you started out receiving government assistance with 5 children, you would get assistance for each of those children. But if you then had a 6th child, no more for that child. But we knew it really wasn't about cost savings, because if you started with 1 child and then had a 2nd child, like many people do as they're growing their families, you would get no cash assistance for that 2nd child. So I filed a bill with your support and many of our colleagues that said, let's repeal that regulation. It doesn't make sense to hurt children when a baby's diaper is soiled. Mom and dad need to be able to have the resources to change that diaper. We need to make sure that every child, particularly children born into poverty, have their basic needs met, and that's what this cash assistance does. And I'm really proud of our work, and it was an overwhelming amount of support from the legislature. Many of our colleagues, Republicans, Democrats, that voted for this to repeal it, and the governor opposed it, and now we have to go back and do it again, and we'll get there.
Right, and remember, we're talking about, number one, a small amount of money.
Very small.
And number 2, we're talking about punishing not the parents, but the kids.
Right.
We're talking about that child that had the misfortune of being born into a family that was on assistance. That child did nothing wrong, but that child will not have the funds available to help.
Yeah, and I think it's even a fine line. So when we talk about misfortune of children, we're talking about children whose families are at the moment living in poverty. And as you know, I talk often about my own background. I was born into poverty. My parents worked really hard. My dad was a disabled Vietnam vet who did 2 tours. My mom worked really hard at a nursing home, working 60, 70 hours a week. Does that mean that because they were working hard and not making a lot of money that they should not have children?
Right.
And our lives went on with support from people in government who made support to make sure we had basic necessities. My brother and I now give back to our community.
That's right.
And we give back in revenue and lots of other things. So it's about saying who do we want to be as a society? And during the debate 20 years ago, it was about trying to punish women for having children. I don't think many people today would think of that as an aspiring goal.
I love the point you raised. Where would we be without the children of these families that 20 years ago we thought were essentially unnecessary or
didn't have the right to be born.
Right.
I mean, and so I think it's about saying, as a community, we understand that life circumstances are not always in our control. And do we see ourselves as part of a community that really lifts one another up and takes care of each other, invests in each other? I might be doing fine now, but one sickness, one accident, bad health in my family, it could all go away, either permanently or temporarily. And do we think that people's lives deserve to just sort of crumble at that moment? Or do we want to step in and say, let's help you, let's invest in you right now? And that's, I think, when we look at, and you asked me about my commitment to children, it really stems in looking at children who are the most vulnerable, right? Poverty is it's not an identity. It's something that's not permanent, and it doesn't have to be permanent. If we take what we know about how to get to the roots of poverty, and we invest in families, and we give children the opportunity to excel, and that means giving them the opportunity to have good nutrition. So whether that's support through a food pantry or an after-school program, and we give parents additional tools that they need in that moment, the more you can give parents tools to help support their children, the easier it is for them to get back on their feet.
One of the earliest programs that you were working very strongly for was early education for children, because we know the evidence is clear that children who start school earlier have a better opportunity later.
And we also know that it costs us more money as taxpayers to help those children catch up when they actually get into elementary school, and particularly it becomes really noticeable when they hit third grade. So, investing in early childhood education, making sure that every child has an opportunity to have access to a great program with really good, qualified educators is important. And if we don't think that's important enough in itself, then the other issue is that we actually do pay for it.
Right.
We do pay for what it means to help those families and children catch up when it becomes really clear that the discrepancies by the time they get to third grade. But truthfully, we could see it as a very selfish thing. The more we help all children actually see their potential, the better off all of our lives will be. We don't know what that child's potential is waiting to be unleashed, and what that benefit will be for the rest of us.
That's right, same point we're making. If we could survey the children who benefit from that 20 years, 30 years, 40 years later, what inventions did they create? What developments did they create? What programs did they create that benefit society altogether?
Whose lives did they touch just with an act of kindness, right?
Right.
Who did they inspire by challenging themselves to do something people thought was impossible, right? So it's like the big changes that people can make in the world, and then it's the small changes.
Right.
And boy, are we at a time in which I think investing in each other as people and trying to bring out the best in all of us. It's I think there's a time, at least for me, when I say, wow, more than ever do we need to actually be each other's cheerleader and figure out how to invest in the potential that does benefit all of us.
Yeah, one bill that the governor did sign into law was the Criminal Justice Reform Bill that we worked long and hard on, and
Yeah.
I know we're both very proud of. One of the programs within that we both worked on was called Restorative Justice, and that's an opportunity that some people in Bedford actually were very closely behind in the beginning, to allow, in the right circumstance, the victim of a crime and the perpetrator of a crime early on, identified by the police chief or prosecutor, to say, you know what, we don't have to affect the lives of these people if we can work this out. And it may be that someone made a mistake. It may be that someone did something intentionally, but they could learn from it, in a personal situation. And with as long as it's voluntary, as long as the victim is willing to do that.
Right.
This is a program where a victim can have a series of meetings with the perpetrator and say, you did this to me. When you stole this from me, you knew my child, for example, and you took this from my home. It hurt me. It violated my privacy and my, and this is what happened. And that perpetrator has an opportunity to learn, there's a ramification, and especially a young person. Sorry, I don't mean to sort of ramble on.
No, but Ken, I think and it's one of the things that I love having you as a colleague, right? I mean, you just come to this with, I think, a big heart and a really big brain and lots of experience and, commitment to figure out how do we work through sort of what's at the root here. And I think when we talk about restorative justice, there's a lot of data that shows us, right, when people actually commit acts of crime, people have to be held accountable for that. When you break the law, you need to be held accountable and deal with the consequences. But if they're given the opportunity, in addition to that, to also really talk to the person who they've caused harm to, two things can happen. And we've seen this in restorative justice circles that have happened all over the country and in circles that I've seen. one, that the perpetrator really has to actually own the pain of
Right.
of what their actions cause. Because it's very easy sometimes to divorce yourself from your actions when you're not left to live out those consequences, right? But that a victim is of generous heart enough to be able to willing to sit with someone who's caused that harm to them and to be able to say to them, this is what you've done, this is what we have to live with on a daily basis. The opportunity for that person to really appreciate and understand and feel their actions and the harm that they've caused, we see less recidivism, where they're actually not going back out to commit that crime, and in fact they become part of the solving this, and they become some ambassadors. But the other thing is that for the victim, and I think this is the most important thing, is that it also becomes an opportunity to heal. And whether forgiveness is a part of that, or whether there's some kind of amends, making of amends that has to take place, for the victim, it's very empowering to be able to look the person in the eye who caused them or their family members harm, and to see that they can actually hold that person accountable. And then we've seen where often healing can take place, because living with that anger and that pain is also, it continues to victimize you.
Right.
And so we may not be able to take away what happened, but if you talked enough to people who've been victimized, who've gone through this experience, there's something that, and they are the most important people in this in many ways, there's a healing that they would not have had necessarily.
Right. One of our goals in the criminal justice system is to create law-abiding citizens from people who made a mistake or who broke the law and it wasn't such a mistake, right?
Yeah.
So that if through this program they become a person who's never involved with the criminal justice system again, because they looked at their victim in the eye and they saw them as a person, not as an opportunity.
Right.
Suddenly that changes.
Right.
And sometimes, like you say, the victim is able to see the circumstance of the person that did this and say, I understand why you chose this, but it wasn't the right choice to make,
Right.
and this is what you did to me when you made it.
I think our work and that bill also, and how we addressed juveniles as well, was really
Right.
important. Young people make mistakes, and our hope is that the mistake actually doesn't redirect the course of their life moving forward. And so when it comes to looking at their records and who has access to their records and their opportunity for them to, they had to deal with the consequences, but to move into adulthood with a cleaner slate that makes life maybe remove some of those obstacles that otherwise would have been there with records that people could have accessed. I think it's really important that we were able to say we do need to look at young people very differently than we do as adults who make illegal choices and who commit crimes. And so I'm really proud. There's a lot that went into that bill around sort of trying to really reassess how we address young people.
Giving people a chance. The other thing is bail reform. We have a way of dealing with people that first enter the criminal justice system, and some people can afford bail and some people can't. And if they can't, they stay in jail. And we don't have debtor's prison by name, but you know what? That's the result when people are left into lockup because they can't
Right.
afford to get the bail to get themselves out.
And yeah, I could see where some people say, well, too bad. If you shouldn't have committed the crime, you deserve to be there. But I think the bigger question we have to ask is, do we want a justice system that's really based on people's wealth? And that's really what that was. So you have more flexibility for committing a crime because you know that you can get out on bail because your family has money or you have money versus someone who doesn't. That the punishment should be as equitable as possible, and being able to buy your way out while you're waiting, your sentencing or trial shouldn't be an option. It should be something that we treat everybody.
Yeah, the system of bail really is two parts. One is this person a danger? Should this person be in lockup? Because if they're walking around, and that's called a dangerousness hearing, and the judge will hear whether this person is accused of a violent crime, the person may repeat it again, things like that's one side. And then the other side is to provide a security so the person comes back in to face the charges. And for some people, that security can be very small by comparison, but to them, it's $1 million. To
Right.
them, it's an insurmountable number.
Sure.
So if we can work out a solution to this problem so that people are treated the same.
Yeah.
And this bill attempts to do that. This law now attempts to do that,
That's right.
which makes sense because that's all you're trying to do in setting a bail amount is the security of getting them back. That's your goal. Are there other parts of this bill that are important to you that I know that you've seen? Because I know you worked so hard on it.
I think we're touching on sort of the core parts of this, and I think it's important to remember that when we address this, that we hadn't actually had criminal justice reform in 30 years,
Right.
And I think that, we live, as you and I know, we live in a big state. And there's very different opinions of what does criminal justice reform look like? What does justice look like? And so I think one of the things that I'm most proud of is that we were really able to, I think, make some big changes that really do look at sort of the issues of equity and access to the criminal justice system and how it impacts you once you're in it and once you leave. And are we helping people who come through the criminal justice system, both as victims and perpetrators? Are we empowering them to have some of their lives back in a stronger way when they leave, or are we making it harder for them to go back into the world? And
Right.
I think that this bill and the series of things that we did actually, I think for everyone involved, it says, we're going to figure out how to strengthen individuals so they can go out and become, they contribute more fully.
Right. Now, another way that we made people's lives safer in this community is through a bill called ERPO. It was a bill that you filed. And why don't you talk a little bit about that? We talked about that in an earlier show.
Yeah.
We devoted that while it was going through, but now it's the law. So talk about that.
So I think it's important. I think there's so many parts of the story. It's what happens when you actually sit with your constituents and you listen to things that are important to them. This is a bill that was important to one of my constituents who was also a college student, and it was his best friend and was suicidal, and he had a gun, and his parents kept trying to take the gun away from him, and the gun store kept selling him the gun. Now, this is not in Massachusetts because we have laws that actually take a long time to figure out what the process is for being able to legally buy a gun. This was in another state, but we did not actually pass a law here that would have protected this young man, and it's called the Red Flag Law or Extreme Risk Protection Order. What happens when somebody in your home has a gun and you know that they're going to hurt themselves? You know that that person is going to kill themselves, or they're going to go out and hurt someone else. There was no good, strong process in place to try to quickly take that gun away. Various police chiefs had certain discretion they could use, but we had police chiefs all over the state supporting this bill because they saw it as another important tool to expedite what it means to take away a gun from someone who at that moment is going to harm themselves or others. And so I filed this bill talking to my constituents. And then over time, what we've seen over and over again is that there has been the number of gun deaths in our country that happen daily, and then the mass shootings that are occurring. So this bill was in the committee process, and it was moving forward. And as you know, before Parkland happened, we had a hearing on this, and it was kind of a wake-up call for me. While I've always supported common sense gun laws, I've never been the lead sponsor of this, and here I was testifying on the importance of this bill, and it was pretty scary, the blowback I got just for testifying on the idea that there might be a reason to separate someone from their gun who might harm themselves. The threats, the bullying, that it was pretty nasty. Soon after that, as I was still trying to make sense of what is going on here, Parkland happened, and a lot of young people, I believe 17 people, lost their lives, young people and adults in Florida. And what we saw was a rise of young people throughout our state who started calling us and coming to the State House and saying, are you doing everything you possibly can to keep us safe? And I know that you and I are really proud of the fact that in our first session, we were part of voting for the most comprehensive common sense gun laws in the nation, which meant that Massachusetts has the lowest gun violence and the homicide rates in this. But young people were saying, is there more for you to do? And this bill was the answer. Yeah, there is more that we can do.
Right.
And so to watch how many young people engaged in this legislative process and learned to lobby and started talking to each other as well about sort of the culture of their school, what sets up somebody to actually want to hurt someone else or hurt themselves, and are we doing everything we can as a school community to address those issues of bullying and isolation and what young people struggle with. And then you had the moms, right? So Moms Demand Action, which included dads as well, but this organization where parents were rising up and saying to all of us, are you doing everything to keep us safe?
Right.
And I mean, for me, the good news is that we had a speaker who has made it very clear how important this issue was, and he took a lot of courage in 2014 when he led the charge to have a task force and come together. And I think the hope was that this would, inspire the rest of the country to move. And it didn't happen. Other states didn't follow as quickly as we did.
Right.
But then we had this bill. And it really gave young people and high school students and parents the opportunity to really engage with legislators. And for me to have so many colleagues like you and other people who were like, how can we help get this bill passed? And it was really about having a lot of conversations with our colleagues who are concerned that for many of our colleagues who live in communities that have gun clubs, where and who are constantly there's some fear mongering that comes down from the national groups like the NRA, and the fear mongering is someone's trying to take your gun away just because they want to.
Right.
And this is not about
That's not true.
taking away your gun, right?
Right.
Nobody in government, and I don't think I don't, you don't. I want to make sure that if somebody's going to hurt themselves, whatever they happen to have access to, but we know that if you have a gun, you have over a 90% success rate of committing suicide.
Well,
Let's remove it.
Yeah, there are many gun owners in my district. I don't know of one that believes that everyone should have access to a gun. I don't believe that, because every gun owner I talk to says, oh, of course, people who are undergoing mental illness at the time aren't appropriate. People who are a felon don't have access to a gun. No, I don't think anybody.
Right.
So when we're talking about taking away your gun, it depends on the you. And if the you is someone that their friends and family see are a threat to themselves at the time, and then go to a judge, and the judge agrees with that,
Yeah.
and then for a temporary time says, okay, to keep that person safe, we're going to hit a pause. They'll get it back
That's right.
eventually.
That's right.
But for now, this isn't an appropriate match for that person.
Do you know that most people who've had their guns removed from them because of an extreme risk protection order in other states that have it, when it was time for them to actually be able to have their gun back to them, have said no thanks?
Yep,
And because
right.
most of the time it's about suicide, and they've decided that they actually don't want their guns back. So I think what's so powerful about this experience and this story is that before Parkland, before high school students and parents started really engaging legislators throughout the state, the NRA was able to try to create a narrative that just wasn't true and scare people. I mean, their whole thing is we're going to scare people into not having dialogue with each other. And we're going to create these extremes, and you're with us or you're against us. And this bill, really, young people and parents forced us to say, enough. You're going to talk to each other, and you're going to figure out and answer the question, are you doing everything to keep us safe? And over 80% of the people polled through 2 different polls in Massachusetts actually said, we don't think somebody should have a gun if they're going to harm themselves, if it's been well documented. And the bill also provided due process in a way that didn't
Right.
exist before this. So you had a lot of gun owners and law enforcement who also appreciated the due process. You now have the opportunity within 10 days, you're going to get before a judge when they first evaluate that your gun should be taken away. Within 10 days, you're going to be back in front of that judge to make a case that, in fact, that was not the right call. And before this bill, it could take anywhere from 3 months to a year, even if you had the right to have that hearing, that there was a backlog and you weren't getting in right away. So.
Yeah. Some of the advocacy groups, and we know that when we get emails, sometimes they say the same thing several times, so we know that there's a group behind it. And one of the arguments was, you're picking on the poor person who may have just lost their wife or husband or job, and you're kicking them when they're down because now you're taking their gun away. And when I read that, I thought, that's exactly the person I'm concerned about.
That's right.
Because when they are down like that, that's when they might make a choice to do something.
And so
that
was
otherwise
most
they
of
wouldn't.
Massachusetts, right?
Yeah.
Our constituents around the state made it clear this was something that they, and I think it's opened up, it's given an opportunity for a lot of elected officials to start having more honest conversations. Before, I think there was this political pressure on people. You had to choose a side.
Right.
You're with us, you're against us. And, elected officials want to work with their constituents. They don't want them to be mad at them. And this wasn't a case where people said, we want you to have these conversations and figure out what we really want. And when we listened, we understood that the majority of residents in all of our districts said, we want to be safe. We want to know that if somebody is going to hurt themselves or hurt someone or hurt themselves, that we've removed that thing that could actually hurt them, and there's no second guessing.
And from a more general concept, the reason that we're able to do work like this is because here in Massachusetts, we still have campaign finance reform that survives what the federal government can do. So when you mention the NRA, they can't contribute to candidates in state government here in Massachusetts to the same extent that they can contribute nationally. Our laws are more protective of that. And so lobbyists in general, or I should say these advocacy agencies that have this money, they don't have the same influence. And one of the ways that I think it probably affects Congress and federal government differently than with us is because those are the groups putting the pressure on legislators to act in a certain way, or perhaps to showboat in a certain way, to show them that we're still fighting with you, which is sometimes counterproductive to actually getting work done.
It is, and I would say that I go back to 2014, where we did not have all of the courage of legislators who wanted to be with us, who at the 11th hour did not vote with us on the comprehensive common sense gun legislation, and that was the political fear that rained down on them in those days prior to that vote from the NRA and from Goal. And I think what happened this time is many of those people said to some of those political organizations, you know what? I'm going to talk to my constituents. You're not going to tell me what my constituents think, nor am I going to let you translate to my constituents what you think this is about. I'm going to have honest conversations. You know, we have a colleague who represents residents in Georgetown and who is an active, recreational gun user, belongs to gun clubs, and he brought people from opposing sides. I could not be more proud of him. During this whole debate, he knew how serious this was, and as a gun owner himself, and as a member of his community, he wants people to be safe. He brought, and he still does this, he has been bringing people from opposing sides, from different advocacy groups, the gun clubs, to sit down and from the Moms Demand Action and have conversations. And they have been meaning to say, okay, let's actually really talk about this. And I think that's what was different now than what was in 2014, is that when we could say, even if there's not a lot of money raining in on individual contributions for elected officials, there was still, in 2014, there was a lot of political fear that was being used. And I think what many of us were able to do through the activism of young people and parents was to say, we're cutting the middleman out. We're not allowing these organizations to distort what this is about. And at the end of the day, it's about what do my constituents believe is going to keep them safe. And I think that's why we passed it.
Right.
Overwhelming numbers.
We did. And as you said, and that's important, is we're able to stay close to our districts. We're able to stay close to our constituents. When we go about our work, another thing we've commented, there have been a lot of comments about our session. And we represent the people of the Commonwealth, but we also represent the people in our district. And there are some times where the goals of the people in our district or the attitudes are a little different.
Yeah.
And we're still able to get together and compromise. These bills might not be what we would do if we were only representing the interests of one district. It was only something that I wrote. Things would be different. Things that I've written have been changed, as they should be, because that's compromise.
351 communities, right? I mean, Massachusetts, and 160 of us, represent those communities in the House. And I think one of the things that you and I have done well is that we clearly know who lives in our district and what's important to them, and what's important to them is often what's most important to us. I know both of us have taken the time to go out and meet our colleagues in their districts. And, I'm very clear that Cambridge voted me to bring their values to the State House. And, each legislator has a community that they're held accountable. And so I've appreciated those of us who've actually taken the time to get to know each other. And I know that legislators have this colleague from Georgetown. He's a very different constituency than mine does. And I respect his ability to understand the values of his community. But our job is to figure out how to respect each other and talk to each other. Are there places where we can actually agree? And if not, then I have more work to do, and more work to do with not only my constituents but people around the state to say we've got to make the case for this, and so that legislators feel like they are responding to their constituents.
What's interesting is that we have to learn as legislators when it's time to speak and when it's time to listen, because they both have their place. And there are some times where we meet with our constituents, we listen to what their feelings are, their attitudes are, and then there are other times where we explain to each other, sometimes to our constituents, look, this is what the situation is that we're facing, and this is why some of the things that we're doing, so that there's an understanding. Not everybody agrees all the time, but at least they're entitled to understand how we got there.
Yeah. No, it's a fascinating job. I think it's an incredible job. But there's many hats that we wear, both in our communities, as whether it's listeners, or sometimes we're put in opportunities to actually be part of helping to knit our community together through conflict or moments that aren't always where people don't see eye to eye. And then we've got to figure out all the stakeholders that, people who are important to our constituents. Why are they, presenting a certain position? People that are important to our colleagues. It's just, It is a fascinating job. I love it.
It is, and I appreciate.
And I love
the
working with you.
I was going to
so.
say thank you very much, because I appreciate the opportunity to work with you too. It's been a great 3 sessions, and we're looking forward to another one working together. Representative Marjorie Decker, thank you for coming on to Rapping with the Rep. And thank you for everything.
Thank you, and I'm excited to go hang out in Burlington now and do some shopping.
There you go. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you next time.